The Mexican border town of Ciudad Juarez was once considered the most violent city in the world, outside of a war zone, because of the drug war. But over the last couple of years, there's been a decline in violence. That's good news for the more than 1.3 million residents. But now, many are seeking justice for those killed or missing. Hundreds of women disappeared in what's been labelled a widespread problem of femicide. And that's the subject of the new book, More or Less Dead: Feminicide, Haunting, and the Ethics of Representation in Mexico. Joining us is the book's author, Alice Driver, a freelance writer, editor, and translator. Thanks for being here.
No, thank you for having me.
What exactly do we mean by femicide?
Femicide is a term that I think many people find confusing because a lot of times people use it just to talk about the physical violence against women, which often involves rape and ends in murder. But in a larger context, in what I'm writing about, we're looking at cultural, institutional, and economic violence, all things that put women at risk for these types of physical violence. So it's much larger than just the physical violence.
Since when has it been happening, and why in the particular context that you're looking at?
In the particular context of Juarez, it started to be noticed around 1994, the time of the NAFTA free trade agreements. In the larger context of Mexico, it's been something that's been happening, but that's been not necessarily recorded or noticed as separate, because everything is recorded under homicide. Someone was killed, rather than thinking about, here are women who have been anally or vaginally raped, whose nipples have been cut off. I mean, we're talking about very specific acts of violence against the physicality of a woman, and so these kinds of things really weren't recorded, I think, and it was only in 1994 that a woman who founded the first domestic violence center in Juarez started actually recording these things herself and sort of brought them to larger attention.
Yeah, so how do you deal with the data then and the statistics? I mean, I would assume that even here in the United States, if a person is raped and then murdered, then are those two offences actually recorded, and is there a way of unpacking that and saying, well, this is femicide, but I mean, women are always subject to more violence than men are. How do you unpack it?
I think it's really hard to unpack it, and I think that's something that's still happening, especially on the legal level, where it's being defined. What does this mean? What does it mean in the legal system? Because even now, in terms of recording it, I would say in Mexico, all statistics are subject to question, because the governor of Peña Nieto, and this is something that's happening right now, really does not want statistics to be recorded, and he sort of almost made them up. You know, when he came into office, he said violence has gone down 18%. So there's a big issue with statistics in general, and there's a problem with recording feminicide, and a lot of the people who are doing it are actually academics, people that I've worked with, or even people in the U.S. There's a librarian named Molly Malloy who's been doing a lot of the work in terms of recording not just the violence against women, but in terms of homicide statistics as well, because in Mexico you really can't count on what information you're getting.
In Mexico, who are the women who are being attacked? Can you make socioeconomic, demographic generalizations?
That's a very good question. They're predominantly extremely poor. You're talking about women. That's why when I talk about this, I talk about economic violence, because these are women who are already put sort of at risk by, a lot of them work in transnational corporations that are along the border. They're doing primarily manual, repetitive movements. They're paid very low wages, and all of these jobs are predominantly held by women. They're making maybe $80 a week. These are the kinds of wages that where do you live when you make $80 a week? You live on the edge of the city. You live in a house that you made out of leftover recycled materials. You live in an area that has no lighting, no sewage, no services, no policing. And so you're already at risk. And these are predominantly the women who are experiencing this kind of violence, and it also relates to the sex trade.
How?
Because a lot of these women, they're either, the reason my book is called More or Less Dead is because a lot of the victims disappear, and the families never know what happened to them, and that's why they're more or less dead, because you can probably say 10 years down the road, okay, my daughter disappeared. For example, Paula Flores, her daughter disappeared in 1998. Eventually the body was found. But during that time period when you don't know where the body is, it's very likely that that person is dead. But as a parent, as a mother, as a father, you're never going to give up hope that that person is alive.
I wanted to ask you about Paula and her daughter within the context of like how the families then respond and whether there's any institutional help for them, whether they then become activists.
That's an excellent question. Paula was actually the woman that inspired my book. I saw her in a film, a documentary film, in 2008, and I was so moved by her story because her daughter was murdered, the body was found, she had been raped, and Paula was very floored. She was very poor. I've been to her house in Juarez. She lives in an area like the one I described where it's very informal settlement, and she at first didn't know what to do. She was sort of trapped by the pain of this, but she became an activist. She has become the face of a movement. And it was incredibly powerful for me to see what happened to her and how she took that pain. And she's not someone who has money or resources, but she's worked for NGOs. She founded a school in the name of her daughter. It's an elementary school. So she's done a lot of really positive things in light of what happened to her.
I mean, when you say that you were there at her home, you traveling through Mexico and going to Juarez, what obstacles did you face? I mean, how did you feel safe?
I did feel safe. I was first there in 2011, which was when it was still the most violent city in the world. But I was lucky enough to have a really good network of academics and of journalists. I ended up meeting a lot of journalists during my work.
Local journalists?
Local journalists, one of whom is Julian Cardona. Anybody who goes through Juarez probably meets him. And the journalists took care of me. I mean, this book wouldn't exist without them. Every time I was in Juarez, they were basically shuttling me around because it wasn't, when I was there, I couldn't just wander around on my own.
Do we have some culpability for all of this in the sense of promoting the war on drugs? The levels of violence in Mexico that we've seen spike over the past decade are just horrifying, and in particular violence against women. Should we rethink our role?
Absolutely. I think we have a role in terms of thinking about the economic violence. We send our corporations to Mexico to take advantage of lax laws where we're not paying predominantly women a living wage. The drug war, we are the largest consumer of drugs in the world, and yet we act like we're fighting a war. We should be, fighting our own war, which is called stop, consuming so many drugs, because we're producing the demand, and we're producing a lot of the violence, which also affects women. So I think the U.S. has a lot to think about in terms of its role.
Are you optimistic that things are going to get better on the ground in Mexico anytime soon? I
am optimistic right now, especially with the firing of journalist Carmen Aristegui, which just happened recently. She's a top journalist in Mexico. She broke a big scandal about President Peña Nieto and his wife, and she was basically taken down for doing that, she and her team. And I think that Mexico's really reaching a tipping point in terms of the amount of corruption, the corruption of institutions, and the disappearance of people, which has come to a head with the 43 students that were disappeared last September, who still, their bodies haven't been found. So I am hopeful that people and citizens can make change.
Thanks, Alice.
No,
Good to
thank
talk to you. Thanks for being here. To check out Alice's book, you can check out the resource well below. There's a link to it there.